A millionaire CEO collapsed behind the wheel, only to be saved in the most shocking way by a 7-year-old girl who took control of his car. The night air carried the hum of the city, a steady rhythm of traffic and neon lights bouncing off the glass towers. 7-year-old Lily Peterson walked along the sidewalk with her small backpack swinging against her shoulder, her blonde hair catching bits of light from the street lamps. She was used to being careful, used to hurrying home before it got too dark, but tonight something unusual stopped her in her tracks. From across the street came a sharp, constant sound, the long unbroken note of a car horn pressed down without pause. It wasn't the kind of quick honk she had heard before, this one dragged on endlessly, cutting through the noise of the city like a warning. Curiosity and fear battled inside her, but curiosity won. She crossed the street cautiously, her sneakers tapping against the pavement as she drew closer to the car parked crookedly near the curb. The windows were fogged slightly, and the headlights cast a pale glow onto the asphalt. She thought for a moment that maybe someone had leaned on the horn as a prank, or that the car had broken down, but when she peered inside, her breath caught in her throat. A man in a light blue suit sat behind the wheel, his broad shoulders slumped, his head resting heavily against the steering wheel. The horn screamed because his weight pressed down on it, his body limp, his eyes closed. For an instant Lily froze, her small fists tightening around the straps of her backpack, her heart hammering in her chest. She was just a child, too small to know what to do, too young to understand why her instincts screamed that this man needed help immediately. She stood there on the curb, debating whether to run and find an adult or shout for someone nearby, but the street around her was strangely empty, the few passing cars speeding by without slowing. The man didn't stir, didn't lift his head, and she realized that if she wasted time looking for help, it might already be too late for him. Her pulse quickened, fear prickling up her spine, but there was also a strange determination rising inside her, the kind of instinct that told her she couldn't simply walk away. Lily stepped closer, reaching for the handle of the car door with a trembling hand. The sound of the horn roared in her ears, so loud it made her wince, but she pressed on, pulling at the handle. To her surprise, the door gave way easily, swinging open as if inviting her inside. The smell of cologne and leather filled her nose, mixed with something sharp, something that didn't belong. She looked at the man again, taking in the details she had barely noticed before, his dark brown hair matted slightly at the forehead, his skin pale under the glow of the dashboard lights, the slight twitch of his fingers that made her believe he was still alive, though slipping further with each passing second. Her breath came faster as she realized the enormity of the moment. She was just a little girl, standing alone in the middle of the city at night, staring at a man she didn't know but who clearly needed her help. Fear told her to run, but something stronger kept her rooted to the spot, whispering that she had to act, that this was her responsibility now. She tightened her grip on the door, her small frame silhouetted by the lights of the passing traffic, and took a hesitant step forward. The weight of what she was about to do settled heavily on her, but beneath the fear there was a spark of courage she never knew she had. Lily's pulse quickened as she climbed onto the edge of the car's seat, her small hands gripping the steering wheel that still blared its endless cry. The sound was deafening now that she was inside, but it was not the horn that frightened her most, it was the man slumped beside her, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, his chest rising only in shallow movements that barely reassured her he was still breathing. His face, illuminated by the faint glow of the dashboard, looked sharp and strong, but in that moment there was a fragility to him that unsettled her. He looked like someone important, someone who belonged in tall buildings and polished suits, not like a helpless figure trapped in a silent struggle. For a few long seconds she didn't know what to do. Her father had shown her once, in a quiet parking lot, how the pedals worked and how to turn the key, but that was a memory wrapped in laughter and safety, not in fear and desperation. She glanced at the man again and whispered, almost pleading, "Please, wake up." There was no response. The horn droned on, steady and merciless, and the reality of the moment pressed down on her small shoulders. If she waited, no one might come. If she ran for help, he might not last until she returned. A thought formed with terrifying clarity: she was the only one here who could do anything at all. Her tiny hands reached out, trembling, and pushed at his shoulder. He shifted slightly, his weight heavy, his body unyielding. She pushed harder, grunting with the effort, and managed to slide him enough toward the passenger seat that the pressure on the horn released. The sudden silence was so startling that it rang louder in her ears than the noise had, but relief didn't last. The man remained unconscious, his head lolling weakly to the side, and she realized she had only taken the first step. Her heart pounded as she slid fully into the driver's seat, her feet barely reaching the pedals, the steering wheel much too large for her small arms, yet somehow it felt inevitable. She looked through the windshield at the world outside, the wide street stretching ahead, the lights of the city glowing like distant stars, the faint outline of the hospital sign several blocks away that she had seen before on family walks. It felt impossibly far, yet she clung to the thought that if she could only get there, someone stronger, someone who knew what to do, would take over. Her hand trembled as she turned the key, still resting in the ignition, and the car roared awake. The sound filled her chest with both dread and determination. She pressed the brake carefully, recalling her father's words about control, about steady hands, and when she shifted into drive, she felt a jolt of courage flicker in her veins. The car lurched forward awkwardly, her foot pressing too hard at first before she corrected it, her body thrown slightly back against the seat. She gripped the wheel with both hands, her knuckles white, eyes wide as she guided the heavy machine onto the road. Every passing second felt like forever. Headlights from other cars flashed angrily, horns blared behind her, and more than once she swerved too far before pulling the car back on course. Tears blurred her vision, but she blinked them away fiercely, refusing to let herself give in to fear. She whispered over and over, as much to herself as to the man beside her, "Hold on, please hold on, we're almost there." Beside her, the man groaned faintly, a sound so weak she wasn't sure she had imagined it. That tiny sign of life became her anchor, pushing her forward with renewed determination. She adjusted her grip on the wheel, straightened the car the best she could, and kept her gaze locked on the faint glow of the hospital sign in the distance. Every block conquered was a victory, every red light ignored a risk she was willing to take, because time mattered more than rules. And though fear clawed at her from every side, deep inside her something stronger burned, a courage far too big for such a small girl, the kind of bravery that rises only when someone else's life hangs in the balance. The car rattled as it rolled down the avenue, its weight shifting awkwardly under Lily's unsure hands. She leaned forward in the seat, her small frame almost swallowed by the steering wheel, her blue eyes wide and fixed on the glowing hospital sign that shimmered faintly in the distance like a beacon. The city around her seemed louder than ever, the screech of tires from passing cars, the blast of horns from impatient drivers who couldn't comprehend that a child was guiding this vehicle through the chaos of traffic. Fear clawed at her chest, urging her to stop, to run, to abandon the impossible task, but another voice inside her, faint yet unyielding, whispered that she had already gone too far to turn back. The man beside her stirred faintly, a low groan escaping his lips, and that sound alone convinced her she had to keep going. Her small foot trembled on the accelerator, pressing too lightly at times and too hard at others, causing the car to jolt forward and slow unpredictably. She winced every time the tires screeched against the pavement, afraid she might draw more attention than she could handle, but the hospital lights felt closer with every block. She remembered sitting in the back seat of her father's car, listening as he explained which pedal was for stopping and which was for going. At the time it had seemed like a game, a secret knowledge she might never use, but now those memories played like instructions in her mind, guiding her through the terror of the moment. Sweat gathered on her palms and made the steering wheel slick beneath her grip. She wiped one hand quickly against her dress, her knuckles tightening again on the wheel as she swerved narrowly away from a delivery truck that roared past with a blast of its horn. The driver's angry face flashed for an instant, but Lily didn't care. Her heart pounded so fast it felt like the whole car shook with it, and she whispered under her breath, half prayer and half plea, "Please don't die, please wait, I'll get you there." Her voice cracked, but she forced herself not to cry, knowing tears would only blur the road more. The man shifted again, his head tilting toward her, and in the brief reflection of the streetlights she caught the outline of his face. He looked strong even in weakness, his features sharp and commanding, and something about his presence both terrified and comforted her. She didn't know his name, didn't know why fate had thrown him into her path, but she understood with absolute clarity that his life was now tied to hers. If she failed, he would be gone. That thought gave her strength she didn't know she had. A red light loomed ahead, cars lined up across the intersection, but Lily didn't dare stop. She pressed down harder on the pedal, the engine roaring louder than she thought possible, and the car shot forward into the gap. Drivers braked, horns screamed, a cab swerved at the last second to avoid colliding with her, but somehow she made it through. Her tiny body trembled with adrenaline, but she managed to steady the wheel again. Each near miss only deepened her determination, and the glow of the hospital sign seemed brighter now, closer, like a promise waiting to be kept. The road narrowed as she turned onto the main street leading directly to the emergency entrance. The car jolted over a pothole, the shock throwing her against the seatbelt, but she gritted her teeth and held on. Her arms ached from gripping the steering wheel so tightly, her legs shook from straining to reach the pedals, but she refused to stop. Every ounce of her strength was poured into the simple act of keeping the car moving forward, step by step, yard by yard, until she could almost see the entrance doors gleaming under fluorescent light. For the first time since climbing behind the wheel, she allowed herself a breath that wasn't choked with fear. She could almost taste the relief, almost imagine handing him over to people who would know how to save him. She turned to glance at him, desperate for reassurance, and noticed the faintest flicker of movement in his eyelids. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it gave her the courage she needed for the final stretch. The hospital was close now, and she promised herself silently, with all the fierce determination a 7-year-old could hold, that she would not fail him, not now, not when she had already come this far. The hospital lights came into full view as Lily turned the wheel, her hand slipping slightly against the leather from how tightly she had been holding on. The entrance to the emergency ward was just ahead, glowing under harsh fluorescent lamps that spilled across the pavement, and for the first time since she had taken control of the car, she felt the faint flicker of hope that she might actually succeed. Yet the final stretch was not without danger. The car jerked as her foot pressed unevenly against the pedal, pulling them too close to the curb before she managed to wrestle it back into the center of the lane. The sound of tires screeching echoed in her ears, but she kept going, refusing to let fear paralyze her now. The road leading into the hospital was crowded with late-night taxis, flashing ambulances, and cars dropping off patients. Drivers leaned on their horns when she swerved in too abruptly, but Lily barely noticed. Her gaze was locked on the sliding glass doors where people in scrubs rushed in and out with clipboards and stretchers. That was where she needed to be. She whispered to herself, steady and urgent, almost there, just a little more. Her knuckles turned white as she steered the heavy car into the driveway, her legs straining to keep the brake and gas balanced, her small body trembling with the effort. Inside the car, the man in the blue suit groaned again, his head rolling slightly toward the window. Lily's heart clenched at the sound. It meant he was still alive, still fighting, but it also reminded her that time was running out. She thought about how terrifying it must feel to be trapped in his body, unable to move, dependent on a stranger, and she pressed her foot harder to close the distance between them and the doctors who could help. The hospital sign loomed overhead, and she aimed the car straight at the emergency entrance, determined not to stop until she reached it. The final turn was sharper than she expected. The car swung wide, almost clipping the corner of the building, and for a moment her breath caught in her throat. But she yanked the wheel with all her strength, her arms aching from the force, and managed to bring the car back in line. The vehicle screeched as she slammed the brake, lurching to a stop so sudden it threw her forward against the seatbelt. For a moment she could only sit there, stunned by the silence that followed, the roar of the engine gone, replaced by the pounding of her heartbeat in her ears. She realized then that she had made it. The hospital doors were just feet away. A group of nurses and doctors stood frozen for a moment, staring in shock at the sight of a small child behind the wheel of a car that had nearly skidded into their entrance. Then Lily's voice, high and desperate, broke through the stunned silence. "Help! Please, he's not waking up. He needs help." She pushed at the door, scrambled out onto the pavement, and waved her arms frantically toward the crowd. Her backpack slipped off her shoulder, landing with a soft thud, but she didn't care. Her entire focus was on the man inside the car, slumped motionless in the passenger seat. The medical staff rushed forward, opening the car door, pulling him carefully out onto a stretcher that seemed to appear from nowhere. They moved with the precision of people who had seen emergencies 1,000 times before, their voices sharp and commanding as they checked his pulse and prepared to rush him inside. Lily stumbled back, her chest heaving with exhaustion, her small hands trembling so badly she could barely keep them pressed together. Her knees felt weak, and for a moment she thought she might collapse right there on the pavement. She watched as they wheeled him through the automatic doors, his broad frame dwarfed by the stretcher, tubes and monitors already being attached to his body. For the first time since she had found him, Lily was no longer the one responsible. The weight of that realization was overwhelming. Relief crashed over her like a wave, but so did the release of all the fear she had been holding in. She began to cry, the sobs racking her tiny body as she covered her face with her hands. She didn't care that strangers were watching, didn't care that cars were still honking in the driveway. All she knew was that she had gotten him here, and now it was in the hands of people who knew how to save him. One of the nurses bent down, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Sweetheart, are you all right? Where are your parents?" The question made Lily choke on her tears, because in that moment she felt more alone than ever. But even through the sobbing, she managed to lift her chin and point toward the sliding doors. "Please," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "just don't let him die." The nurse's expression softened, and with a nod she guided Lily toward the waiting area, where the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead and the night silence was broken only by the rushing footsteps of doctors fighting to keep a stranger alive. Lily sat in the waiting area of the hospital, her small legs dangling from the chair, her sneakers not quite touching the floor. The adrenaline that had carried her through the terrifying drive had drained away, leaving her body heavy and her eyelids struggling to stay open. Around her, the emergency ward buzzed with activity, doctors moving swiftly from one patient to another, the echo of announcements over the loudspeaker, the distant wail of sirens outside, but to her it all blurred into background noise. The only thing that mattered was the man in the light blue suit, the stranger she had pulled from death's grip, who was now somewhere behind those closed double doors. She hugged her backpack tightly against her chest as if it could shield her from the uncertainty pressing down on her. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. Every time the doors swung open, she sat up straighter, searching the faces of the nurses for any sign of news. Each time they hurried past without stopping, her chest sank further. She thought about the sound of the car horn that had drawn her to him, the way his body had slumped lifelessly against the wheel, and a shiver ran through her. What if she had been too late even then? What if the hospital couldn't save him? The thought filled her eyes with tears, but she blinked them away fiercely, determined not to cry in front of strangers. She whispered to herself, almost like a prayer, "Please live, you have to live." At last, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor in green scrubs approached. His expression was calm, though the lines of exhaustion marked his face. He crouched so that his eyes were level with Lily's, speaking in a gentle tone that immediately eased some of the fear knotted in her stomach. "You were very brave," he told her. "That man you brought in, he was very sick. If you hadn't acted when you did, he wouldn't be here now. Because of you, he has a chance." The words hit her with such force that she almost didn't understand them at first. Relief flooded her, so intense that she let out a shaky laugh through the tears that spilled freely at last. The doctor placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder and added, "He's stable for now. We're monitoring him closely. You did something extraordinary tonight." Lily nodded, though she wasn't sure what to say. Her heart felt lighter than it had in hours, yet the weight of responsibility still lingered. She was just a child, and yet she had carried the life of a grown man in her hands, guiding him through the streets to safety. That truth both frightened and amazed her. While she sat there, the nurse who had first comforted her returned with a blanket and draped it gently over her shoulders. The warmth settled around her, and for the first time since she had pressed her hands to the steering wheel, she allowed herself to exhale fully. She curled into the chair, holding the fabric tight, her body trembling with the aftershocks of fear and exhaustion. Though she could barely keep her eyes open, her thoughts refused to settle. She wondered who the man was, why he had been alone in the car, and whether anyone else would come asking for him. He had looked important, his suit too fine, his presence too commanding to belong to an ordinary stranger, but to her he was simply the man she had refused to let die. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the beginning of a strange connection, a thread tying her fate to his in ways she couldn't explain. She didn't know his name yet, didn't know that the world outside recognized him as David Collins, the powerful CEO of a corporation whose decisions rippled across entire industries. To Lily, he was simply the man she had found in desperate need, the man she had fought to save when no one else was there. And as she drifted into a restless half-sleep in the stiff hospital chair, she clutched the blanket closer, her final thought before surrendering to exhaustion being a promise she made silently to herself, that no matter who he turned out to be, she would never regret the choice she had made to fight for his life. When David Collins finally opened his eyes, the sterile white ceiling of the hospital greeted him instead of the soft leather interior of his car. For a moment he lay still, his body heavy, his mind clouded, trying to remember what had happened. The last thing he recalled was a sudden weakness creeping through him while he sat behind the wheel, a darkness that pulled him down before he had time to react. Now, as the fog in his head began to lift, he realized he was alive, and that realization filled him with a mixture of confusion and relief. He turned his head slowly, noticing the monitors beside him, the steady beep of his heartbeat displayed on the screen, the faint scent of antiseptic lingering in the air. He tried to push himself up, but the effort left him dizzy, so he sank back into the pillows. It was then that a nurse stepped into the room, her expression soft but firm as she urged him to rest. "You're very lucky," she told him. "You were brought in just in time. Another few minutes and we might not be having this conversation." Her words unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. He was a man used to control, a man who prided himself on strength, and yet here he was, his life having slipped so close to the edge without him even realizing it. He asked, his voice still hoarse, who brought me here?" The nurse smiled faintly and said, "A little girl. She found you, and she drove you here herself. She saved your life." The word struck him like lightning. A little girl? He thought he must have misheard, but the nurse only nodded, confirming it. She explained how a child had pushed him aside in the car, managed to drive through traffic, and pulled into the hospital just in time. David closed his eyes, trying to picture it, trying to reconcile the image of a small child behind the wheel with the fact that he was still breathing because of her. For the first time in years, he felt a kind of humility that stripped away every layer of pride he had built. His fortune, his empire, his reputation, none of it had saved him. A girl no older than 7 had done what none of those things could. Later, when the doctors confirmed he was stable enough to receive visitors, he asked again, more insistently this time, to see her. He needed to look into her eyes, to understand how such a thing had even been possible. When the door finally opened and Lily stepped timidly into the room, her small frame dwarfed by the doorway, clutching her backpack as though it were a shield, David felt his throat tighten. She was so young, her hair messy from the long night, her blue eyes both fearful and determined. For a moment neither of them spoke, the silence heavy with everything unspoken. Then, with a voice roughened by emotion, David whispered, You saved me." Lily shifted nervously, unsure how to respond, but managed to say, "You weren't waking up. I didn't know what else to do." Her honesty disarmed him completely. He had spent years surrounded by people who chose their words carefully, who calculated every phrase around his wealth and power, but this little girl spoke only the truth. He felt something inside him soften, something that had been locked away beneath years of responsibility and ambition. He reached out a trembling hand, not quite touching hers, but close enough that she could feel the gesture. "I owe you my life," he said quietly, and for once the words carried no weight of business or formality, only the raw sincerity of a man who had been given a second chance. As the days passed, he learned more about what had happened from the staff, and each detail left him more astonished. The sheer courage it had taken for a child to climb behind the wheel, the determination to keep going despite the danger, the strength it must have required to push his unconscious body aside, it all humbled him in a way nothing else ever had. He thought about what could have happened if she had been too afraid, if she had walked away, if she had waited for someone else. The thought haunted him, but it also filled him with gratitude so deep it unsettled him. For the first time in years, David Collins, the man who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billions, felt utterly powerless except for the gratitude he owed a child. At night, when the hospital grew quiet and the corridors emptied of visitors, he lay awake thinking about her. He wondered why she had been there at that exact moment, what twist of fate had placed her in his path, and why someone so small had been willing to shoulder the weight of his survival. He had always believed that success was the product of his own willpower, that control over his destiny rested firmly in his own hands, yet now he saw how fragile that belief truly was. His life had not been saved by strength or wealth but by innocence and courage, by a little girl who had simply refused to give up on a stranger. David knew then that he could not walk away from her, not after what she had done. The bond between them had been sealed the moment she turned that key in the ignition. It was not just gratitude that pulled at him but a deeper recognition, as though this event had shattered the carefully constructed walls around his life and revealed something he had long forgotten, the need for connection, the need to let someone else matter more than himself. And as he closed his eyes in the darkened hospital room, he whispered into the silence words meant for no one but himself, "I have to find a way to thank her, to be worthy of what she gave me." Recovery gave David time to reflect, and every day that passed seemed to strengthen the invisible thread binding him to the girl who had pulled him back from the edge of death. He requested that Lily be allowed to visit him often, and soon their meetings became a daily rhythm, something he found himself anticipating with an eagerness he hadn't felt in years. The first visits were quiet, Lily sitting stiffly in the chair beside his bed, her backpack perched on her lap as if she might need to run at any moment. She didn't know how to behave around him, and he, despite being a man who could command entire boardrooms, found himself at a loss for words in front of this child. But silence gradually gave way to small exchanges, and those small exchanges grew into conversations that revealed just how extraordinary she was. He discovered that she carried a weight far heavier than any child her age should bear. Her family was struggling, her father working long shifts while her mother's health had left them with more bills than income, and Lily had learned early on to be independent, to walk herself home, to keep her fears tucked away where no one could see them. When she told him this in a hesitant voice, her eyes downcast, David felt a piercing ache in his chest. He recognized that same loneliness in her that he had spent years covering with wealth and achievements. She, like him, had lived with the constant pressure of survival, though hers was born not of ambition but of necessity. As he regained strength, David began to ask for walks around the hospital garden, and he insisted that Lily accompany him. At first she trailed behind uncertainly, but gradually she began to walk at his side. He noticed the way her face lit up when she talked about her favorite books or when she laughed at her own clumsy drawings, and he realized how rare those smiles must have been in her life. He listened to her intently, something he had never done even for his closest colleagues, because her words mattered in a way others never had. Slowly, the stiffness between them dissolved, and she began to trust him enough to tease him, to challenge him, to tell him stories that had nothing to do with hardship and everything to do with the bright imagination of a child. David, in turn, opened parts of himself he had long kept hidden. He told her about his childhood before the money, about the struggles he had faced when his own father had been absent and his mother had worked tirelessly just to keep food on the table. He admitted that his wealth and power, for all their glitter, had left him emptier than he had ever expected. He told her that when he collapsed in the car that night, he hadn't been afraid of dying but of realizing that no one would be there to mourn him beyond the cold lines of a press release. Speaking those truths out loud was terrifying, but with Lily, there was no judgment. She listened, her blue eyes steady, and sometimes she reached out with a small hand to touch his arm in a gesture so simple yet so healing it nearly broke him. Their bond grew not from dramatic declarations but from the steady accumulation of shared moments. One afternoon she convinced him to try a children's puzzle she carried in her backpack, and he surprised himself by enjoying the challenge, laughing with her when he fumbled with pieces too small for his large hands. Another evening he asked her to read aloud from one of her schoolbooks, her clear voice filling the hospital room in a way that made it feel less sterile, less lonely. Each day, the hospital staff watched with quiet astonishment as the stern, powerful CEO softened before their eyes, transformed by the presence of a child who had reminded him what it meant to be human. For Lily, the change was just as profound. She began to trust that he would not vanish the way others had, that his promises to see her each day were not empty. When he wasn't there, she noticed the absence, and when he appeared, her face brightened with a joy she no longer tried to hide. She started to lean against his side when they walked, to laugh freely in his presence, to fall asleep during visits with her head resting against his arm. Each of these small acts signaled a shift from wary distance to something far more intimate, the trust of a child who had begun to believe in someone again. By the time David was discharged, their connection was undeniable. He knew he couldn't simply let her slip back into the shadows of her old life, and she, though she never said it aloud, seemed to know it too. They stood together outside the hospital doors on the day he was released, the sun painting the city in gold, and he looked down at her with a seriousness that masked the swell of emotion in his chest. "Lily," he said quietly, "I don't want this to end. You've given me more than I can ever repay, but I want to try. I want to be part of your life, if you'll let me." She didn't answer immediately, only studied him with those wide blue eyes, but then she nodded slowly, a small smile breaking across her face. It was a smile filled with trust, with hope, with the promise of something new. And in that moment David knew that their story was only beginning. The weeks after David left the hospital unfolded like a chapter of life he had never expected to live. He threw himself not into board meetings or negotiations but into learning how to keep his promise to Lily. For a man who had built empires, the act of slowing down to understand the needs of a child was both humbling and transformative. He arranged visits to her home, at first tentative, meeting her wary father who struggled to balance gratitude with pride. David did not arrive with pomp or arrogance but with quiet determination, bringing groceries, offering to cover medical bills, ensuring that Lily's mother received proper care. These gestures, though simple compared to the scale of his wealth, carried weight because they were done not out of obligation but out of genuine care. As the days turned into months, his bond with Lily deepened into something unshakable. He discovered that her bravery on the night she saved him was only one part of who she was. She had a sharp wit, a boundless imagination, and a stubborn streak that reminded him of himself. They spent weekends exploring parks, her laughter echoing against the trees as she raced ahead on paths he struggled to keep up with. She introduced him to her favorite stories, curling beside him as he read aloud, her head resting on his shoulder until her eyelids drooped and sleep claimed her. Those quiet evenings became sacred to him, far more valuable than the glittering galas and power-laden dinners he had once thought indispensable. The press, of course, continued to circle, hungry for every detail of the bond between the billionaire and the little girl who had saved him. Headlines speculated wildly about his motives, some praising his newfound humanity, others sneering at what they called a carefully staged redemption. David, for the first time in his life, didn't care what they thought. Public opinion had lost its grip on him the moment Lily called him a friend, and later, when she slipped and referred to him as family, he realized there was no greater title he could hold. For Lily, life also began to change in ways she hadn't dared to dream of. The girl who had once walked home alone in the dark now had someone waiting to take her hand, someone who made her feel safe in a world that had so often been frightening. At school she carried herself differently, her shoulders straighter, her smile freer, because she knew there was someone who believed in her unconditionally. She still clung to her teddy bear at night, but now it was more out of habit than fear, because she had learned to fall asleep with the certainty that she was no longer alone. David often thought back to that night, replaying the image of her small figure climbing into his car, her hands on the wheel, her courage pulling them both through chaos. It was a memory that humbled him daily, reminding him that the most powerful force he had ever encountered was not money, not influence, but the heart of a child who refused to let him die. He sometimes wondered if fate had intervened, if the universe had conspired to place her on that street at that exact moment, and he found himself grateful in a way he could never fully put into words. One evening, months after his recovery, they stood together on the balcony of his penthouse, the city stretching out below in a glittering sea of lights. Lily leaned against the railing, her blonde hair catching the glow, her blue eyes reflecting the skyline. David looked at her and felt an ache in his chest, a mixture of love, gratitude, and awe. He thought of how close he had come to leaving this world without knowing her, without experiencing the second chance she had given him. With a voice steady but thick with emotion, he said, "You saved my life, Lily, but you gave me more than that. You gave me a reason to live it differently." She turned to him, smiling in that quiet, knowing way she had, and slipped her small hand into his. For David Collins, who had once measured his worth in profits and skyscrapers, the moment was more valuable than any empire. He had been shocked into a new life, one where love and family mattered more than all the wealth he had ever gathered, and as he held her hand beneath the endless city sky, he knew with absolute certainty that their story, born in tragedy and fear, had found its way to a beginning that promised nothing but hope.